I am Molly Volanth Hall. I teach at RISD, and I teach in the Literary Arts and Studies department. Primarily, I focus on the environment and war studies within British and kind of global Anglophone literature.
So could you tell us a bit about what first drew you to literature, especially environmental and those type of care?
I was drawn to literature because of how I feel like in the world, words actually do things. So the way that we talk about things affects the way we think about things, which affects our behaviors. And this is particularly true with regards to the environment, which feels very non-human. And so how we think about it impacts our behaviors. With regards to war studies and generally trauma studies, how we understand harmful and impactful experiences is usually narrated by us, kind of in an internal monologue in our minds. So again, the way we tell our stories about ourselves really impacts our behavior. So I thought, what better way to think about how we behave than to do it through these cultural objects that we call literature?
Oh, well, your background spans across literature, education, and critical theory. So was there a moment when you felt this interdisciplinary path began to form, or did it emerge gradually?
When did it become interdisciplinary? I would say when I was in graduate school, probably early on in graduate school, because no one discipline really has all of the answers. So, you could sort of stay in a room reading all the things by yourself, but then you don't have the opportunity to dialogue with others as you do in an educational setting, and anything you learn is kind of dead in the water or lost. It doesn't actually have the ability to grow or be tested as it would in education. And then in terms of critical theory, there's ways in which we need to borrow from other disciplines to learn sort of the ideas that they have to get outside of our own perspective. And so if we just look at the people that are studying literature, for example, we lose insights from sociology, from psychology, from the study of linguistics as a science, for example, as opposed to literature. And so there's a real need to look at things from a different perspective because of the impact of positionality on our ability to create new knowledge or to have new understandings in the first place.
So looking back, what were some of the most or more pivotal decisions in your career? So did you ever consider a path outside of teaching in school?
I did. Actually, I used to be a chef in restaurants and a little bit in catering, which I did because I do love food and I love cooking food and eating food, but it was more something that I fell into by accident. Early jobs when I was younger just happened to be in food service, but I think I chose to go really into academia because this is where I felt like I could make the biggest impact to maybe help the world be a better place. People love eating food and it brings joy and that's good. But it felt like there was a lot of conversations that I had as a teenager, perhaps, and person in my early 20s, where people just were only looking so far. And I was like, what if there was a way to have conversations where we were able to think deeply and maybe like change how we think about things in a way that would allow other people to make different decisions about how they wanted to, form their career or live their lives or become aware of things they could offer to the world that maybe they hadn't had a space to discover those skills or talents or passions before. That just like is very limited in the kitchen where you create food and you give it to somebody and they enjoy it or they don't. I think when I was in college and in graduate school, this sense of community that exists in education, the way that we're always talking to each other, really felt like it had a promise for being able to create not fast change like you would like with policy or maybe if I was a scientist inventing new things, but this kind of slow cultural change where we sort of learn to think differently together. So I think just continuing to be in classrooms myself as a student, while also recognizing that while all these different like ways of being in the world, different career paths people take have impacts, that I wanted one that would impact these sort of slower, more kind of under the radar cultural aspects that often are ignored because they don't give it instant gratification.
So as a Chinese or a Chinese student, I tend to write a lot about how people should live their life. But even though I don't have a lot to say in this, but I feel like people should do what they love. And instead of following other people, following the herd, they should have their own standard of what they want. But when I actually write, I don't feel like they are actually interested in those topics. It's like those people who want to know, who are aware of the situation, will look into them themselves, but those who aren't aware, they won't listen to anyone. They won't read my things. So how would you tackle this problem in your writing?
Well, this is a really age-old or big problem, I would say, in for public intellectualism, because there's some degree to which you can, well, there's some fields of thinking where you could almost trick people into reading what might be good for them to think about, but they may otherwise sort of push off or ignore. So there's ways of writing where, and I sometimes do this. I would say I don't do this as much in my professional writing as I do in public conversation. So if I'm facilitating, say, a reading group, or if I'm facilitating a meeting about trying to make change within an institution, this is where I would use more of this kind of speech. But you can also use it in writing, which is where you invite people in to dialogue with you without signaling what you think that they should say or what you think that they should get out of the conversation ahead of time. And in many ways, it's a little bit, it's almost like trickery because you're pretending not to have an agenda. But if you can come off as authentic as possible, it's really just about identifying that you already see value in your reader, for example, right? So if you're trying to convince somebody who, for example, you're trying to convince somebody to stop eating animals for ethical reasons. You could start off by saying all the reasons why it's horrible to eat animals and factory farming, or you could start off and talk about how important the food is to, like, sitting down with your family and how difficult it would be to give up things like, eating meat because it's so central to our cultures and our memories and our sense of belonging. And then just move one little step in the direction that you want them to think about. And so you're there with him, they're saying the things that they think, and then you're like, but I do wonder about these things sometimes. So trying to be with people where they're at and then just get them to think a little differently, as opposed to, which is more of an emotional connection approach. I find that that's a lot more effective than giving people the facts and hoping they'll do the right thing with them. Because most people just reject facts that would cause them to question the life they've already chosen to lead, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it's like, but there are still a lot of people who aren't willing to read even. They're
Oh, yes.
so getting them to read things we wrote is kind of hard. So what would you think to kind of to
So
help?
just getting people to read who wouldn't normally read things. For me, as a person approaching this from like a literary and cultural scholarly perspective, my argument with that would be that on one level, this would necessitate a longer term cultural shift. We would have to basically raise children differently, and we would need to invite ourselves as adults to revalue reading as a society or as a set of societies globally, not just in any one place. But on another level, I think, again, using this sort of subtle enticement approach of meeting people where they're at. So if you want somebody to read something, but perhaps people are more likely to engage with video media or with like pictorial media to create things that are mixed media. And then people can sort of start to get a taste for the joy of reading as they appear in these mixed media settings. And then perhaps they want to read more. They're more likely to read something they already have buy-in on, in a sense. Yeah.
So as someone teaching in a school of art and design, how do you see the relationship between arts and liberal arts? So what kinds of conversation or tensions emerge when these two words come together?
Yeah. I mean, on the most basic level, the liberal arts study what the arts and design folks produce, right? So we are thinking about the histories and sort of the types of objects that are going to be created on the other side. So one would hope that there's sort of an inherent value to that because the things that people are producing, say in a painting class or an industrial design class, all of those things have a history and a culture. And over in the liberal arts, we'll talk about what that history and culture is and like get you to think about what wider like lineage or conversation you're entering into. But in another sense, I feel like they act as sort of a place to think through ideas that will then inform the work that you're going to do in the studios or in those design practice spaces. So we really think about like why longer, bigger ideas, right? So things that are like, if you're in a class that's studying Islamic art of the 15th century, that's going to get you to think about things in a totally different way. And you're going to encounter ideas that you didn't expect. And in many ways, this is what research is about in general, where you have to go in with an interest, but you can't decide in advance what you're going to find. And most things that people end up, that my students anyways at RISD end up pulling from their liberal arts that inform their studio practice are always things they found kind of as a surprise by accident. They're like, oh, wow, I just read this thing and I love the way that this language is structured. And that really makes me think about this idea that I'm trying to work through in my drawing class. And I'm going to try and use a fractal pattern now that I've seen how sort of the multiplicity of this language is working. Or somebody who is trying to create a small graphic novel about one specific period in their cultural history, and then they take a class and they read about, in my classes, for example, like they read about these various conflicts that are happening in Europe or in Asia or in Middle East, various different places. And they're like, oh, I can see how this back history might inform the story I'm trying to tell. So I think both in the form of formal inspiration, but also like contextual grounding for the things that are going to be created, but also getting a taste of how people are going to perceive your own creations as art and design students when you go out into the world, like, and are become an architect or a painter. The ways that we are treating these objects in the classroom is largely the way that the world will receive them through reviews and in art galleries and in people buying products or companies picking up the designs, so on and so forth. That's the relationship that I tend to see between the two.
Sorry, and maybe this is a little bit off the topic, but what do you think is the standard of a good art? Or does visual effect matter, or the theme that they're trying to convey matter more?
I don't believe that there is one standard. That's sort of very much not something that I would believe. I think that what makes good art is something that does something. I'll simplify it there. It's something that does something, but what the object does can be something it does for the maker, right? It doesn't need to be the exact same message or impact that was intended. It doesn't need to hit the audience the same way. So some art can be produced just because it is sort of evidence of something that was worked through for the artist or maker, and then that object has value in and of itself. I think I would shift it more towards value than goodness or not. But then oftentimes those objects end up having value for audiences and people. And so the other way I would think about it is like, does it have an impact of any kind? Sometimes it can have an impact that you don't know that will grow into something else later, right? So you may see a piece in a gallery and just be like, oh, I hate that. It's so gross. It just makes me feel uncomfortable. And then like you can't stop thinking about it. And so over the next few weeks, you think about why that made you uncomfortable. You're like, oh, what is there something about that thinking right there? It already did something to you. It changed you. It impacted you. But then there's also things that strike people as like, oh, this is beautiful. Or you step in front of a piece, or you read something, or you watch something, or you encounter an object of any kind, and you're like, this is saying something to me about myself or the world, but I did not have the imagery or the feeling or the words to put to it before, and now I do. So it feels like you've been given back a little piece of yourself, or you understand something that your mind wanted to understand, but you didn't yet have the ability to. So I think impact is just impact in general, from the smallest to the biggest levels, is how I would gauge good art and design.
So do you think The Comedian is a good piece of art?
Yes. I'm a really big fan of comedy. And I think that it's high impact and functions in many ways to do some of that covert work of getting maybe beneath or around people's resistance to reading or these things that seem more dry. Comedy is, I think, a very high impact artistic medium, especially today, where it's much more welcoming to consume. Like people are drawn to it and it gives them pleasure, even though it often makes them uncomfortable and makes them think without knowing it. Tricky like
How does the banana make people think?
how does the banana make people think?
Yeah, the art piece is called the comedian.
Oh, the comedian. I thought you meant comedy in
Sorry.
general. So how does that people make? Well, so it depends, right? Because it's not any particular one sense of goodness or value that needs to be communicated. It can strike people in different ways, not only different people, but also people across time. So perhaps in some senses, it makes people question what is art just by itself, right? What is art as art? Often things that are like seemingly overly simplistic will force us to question the medium itself. But other people may come to it and have a very particular associations with bananas, and it might sort of strike them as aggressive, perhaps, or as a pleasing shape. Maybe they've never thought about how the banana has that nice smooth surface. So I think it's really variable and endless. Anything can have an impact. And we often don't know what will. A lot of artistic production, I think, is trying things and then seeing what impact it has.
So do you think what artists intend to do doesn't align with how their viewers view it? So do you think it's still good art when that happened, or it's something else, you think?
I do think that intention and impact don't need to be connected in order for the art to be good. It's great when it does, but I don't think it has to at all for it to be good art.
Do you think money can define how good a piece of art is?
It depends on how you think about money, right? As I said, so the value of a work or what people are willing to pay for it, you mean?
If someone is willing to buy the banana for a very high price, then that means it's very impactful. So you're basically saying that if something is very expensive, then it's going to be a good piece of art.
Well, when you bring capitalism into it, that does complicate things a bit. But I would say, on one sense, that's true, right? Because it clearly has some kind of impact that people will be willing to pay for. So you're paying for the impact, right? But on the other hand, is the market actually the type of impact that we're talking about? So when I'm thinking about impact, I'm thinking about like an emotional or intellectual impact. And there's a sense in which while capital sometimes manipulates our desires and manipulates our sense of where success and value lie, it is not necessarily a good gauge of what is actually impacting us. It's more what we want than what we feel, if that makes sense. So just because everybody wants it, it's more like, for that kind of thing, it would be more like, oh, they're consuming an identity, right? So you're saying, I want to be a person who owns good art. And then everybody is clamoring to own good art, and they want to be a person who owns good art. But that doesn't actually impact anybody necessarily. Good question. I like that.
So lastly, for students who may be struggling with uncertainty about their future paths, what have you learned about making doing the things that you really love to do, or those kind of life choices?
I would say that while, of course, it's important to be able to put a roof over your head and eat food, that everyone I know, including myself, who have chosen careers that have and made decisions about what to do with their career based on what brings them joy and passion and what they feel good about putting into the world, are happy. And I was a middle-aged person, and everyone I know who chose career paths based on trying to ensure financial stability are not as secure in their happiness and are often not financially secure because those things are not predictable. So I think it's really unfortunate that the two things don't always coincide. But if I were to choose money over happiness, I would choose happiness every time. And I think that one of the very fortunate things about RISD in particular is that you then often don't have to choose, which is its own problem anyways, I think, in a very capitalist sense. There are certain schools where you are much more guaranteed a financially stable future in a field where passion does not always bring financial success. And not everybody who's practicing the arts gets the opportunity to have the RISD experience and have access to that. That being said, most RISD students go on to have economically successful lives, which is great for them. But I do think that in my own personal life, I've made many decisions not to do things based on what I would say is what I feel is a vocation and not a livelihood, and that those things are separate for me. And I have no regrets.
Do you think money can buy happiness?
No, that's an easy one. It can buy comfort and safety, but it can't buy happiness.
So what do you think happiness is?
I think happiness is being content in your chosen path, knowing that you not reaching a specific goal, but knowing that you're living the life that you want to lead. So I usually attach it to a sense of integrity, right? So knowing that when every choice that I make is a choice that I made, not that others are making for me, and that I am making because it's in alignment with my values, but also a life where there are more moments of joy than moments of pain. So balance, not like an everyday sort of just I'm happy all the time, but you're not just constantly being wounded by the world or by the people around you. But you, or if even though you are, because we all have to suffer, but that there's enough moments of joy that there's balance.
Do you think money buys dignity?
Well, that's another thing where I feel like intention, or so it's two flip sides. I think that not having money in our world puts people in positions where the systems they're inhabiting attempt to strip them of dignity very regularly. And so that would be more like money buys safety and comfort. It buys you the ability to avoid systems that are attempting to strip you of your dignity. But technically, having dignity is something that is more internal. So people can't take it away from me. If I choose not to feel undignified, then I'm not.
Thank you so much again for sharing your time and thoughts. It's been truly meaningful for me to hear your perspective, and I've learned a lot, and I'm sure other people will do too. And thank you.
I've learned a lot as well. Thank you.
All right. Have a good